The teacup shattered against the kitchen floor. Eliza Hartwell stood frozen, staring at the broken porcelain scattered across boards she had scrubbed on her hands and knees an hour before. Her vision blurred. Not from tears, she had none left, but from exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. Behind her, she heard boots on the porch. Heavy, measured steps. Her new husband returning from the barn. "Do you always work this hard?" Thomas Brennan would ask her that evening, his voice quiet in the lamplight, and her answer would change everything. But that moment was still hours away. 3 weeks earlier, Eliza had stood on the platform at Crestwood Station, Montana Territory, 1882, watching the train that brought her west disappear into gray November sky. She was 31 years old, a widow, carrying everything she owned in a single carpet bag. Thomas Brennan had been waiting beside a wagon, tall and weathered, his face unreadable beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His advertisement had been brief: widower with ranch, seeking capable woman for partnership. No romantic illusions required. She had written back with equal plainness: widow, hardworking, no expectations of affection. They were married by the circuit judge the following morning. No flowers, no celebration, just signatures on paper and a silent ride to his ranch 15 miles from town. The house was larger than she expected. 2 stories, sturdy timber, built to withstand Montana winters. But inside, it carried the weight of neglect. Dust thick on every surface. Dishes piled in the dry sink. Floors that hadn't seen a proper washing in months, maybe years. Thomas's first wife had died in childbirth 3 years before. The baby had not survived either. He had simply stopped maintaining anything that wasn't directly tied to keeping cattle alive. Eliza had not asked questions. She had gone to work. That first week, she washed every dish, every window, every corner. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled. She aired out rooms that smelled of loneliness and defeat. She cooked meals Thomas ate in silence, and she mended clothes he left folded outside her bedroom door each morning. They barely spoke. He left before dawn, returned after dark. They existed in the same house like ghosts passing through separate worlds. She told herself this was the agreement. Partnership, not intimacy. Work, not warmth. But by the 3rd week, something inside her had begun to crack. She woke before sunrise now, driven by some relentless need to prove her worth. She baked bread daily. She preserved the last of the autumn vegetables. She patched curtains, organized the pantry, cleaned the barn cat's feeding bowls, hauled water until her shoulders screamed. And still, Thomas said nothing. No thank you. No acknowledgement. Just silent presence and departure, reliable as weather. This morning, she had risen in darkness again. She had made breakfast Thomas ate without looking up. She had swept the porch, fed the chickens, started laundry in the big iron kettle out back. She had baked 2 pies for the church social she wasn't certain they would attend. And now this. A broken teacup. One stupid, careless moment. Eliza knelt slowly and began picking up the pieces. Her hands shook. The door opened. Thomas stepped inside, removing his gloves. He saw her kneeling among the shards. "You're bleeding," he said. She looked down. Blood welled from a cut on her palm. She hadn't even felt it. "Leave it," he said quietly. "I'll clean this up. I can do it." "Eliza." Something in his voice made her stop. She looked up at him. For the first time since their wedding, Thomas Brennan's face was not unreadable. It was tight with something that looked almost like pain. "Leave it," he repeated. "Please." She stood slowly. He guided her to the table, poured water from the pitcher, wrapped her hand in a clean cloth. His movements were careful, deliberate. Then he swept up the broken cup himself while she sat, too tired to protest. Evening came. Supper was quiet again. But after the dishes were done, after Eliza had already turned toward the stairs, ready to collapse into bed, Thomas spoke. "Do you always work this hard?" She stopped, hand on the banister. The question hummed in the warm kitchen air. Eliza turned slowly. She was so tired. Tired of proving herself. Tired of silence. Tired of marriage feeling like servitude she had volunteered for. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out steady despite everything. "Because if I stop, I'll remember that I'm 31 years old and this is my 2nd attempt at building a life. Because if I'm not useful, I don't know what I am. Because you don't speak to me, Thomas. You don't look at me. And work is the only language I have left." The words fell between them like stones into deep water. Thomas stood slowly. He removed his hat and set it on the table. And what he said next broke something open inside her chest. I thought you preferred the silence. Thomas's words came out rough, like they'd been stored too long and used. He stood with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, his weathered face finally, fully visible in the lamplight. Eliza gripped the banister. Why would you think that? Your letter, he said. You wrote that you had no expectations of affection. I took that to mean you wanted distance. That you'd been hurt enough and preferred solitude. Safety. She stared at him. I wrote that because I thought it's what you wanted. Something shifted in his expression. Almost like recognition. Almost like regret. My first wife. He stopped, swallowed. Margaret talked constantly. Filled every room with words. After she died, the silence nearly killed me. When you came and seemed to want quiet, I thought. He set his hat down. I thought I was giving you what you needed. Eliza felt the exhaustion pulling at her bones, but beneath it something else was rising. Anger maybe, or just truth finally demanding space. What I needed, she said carefully, was to know if I mattered beyond what I could wash or mend or cook. Thomas flinched. I have scrubbed this house top to bottom, she continued, voice strengthening. I have worked myself sick trying to make it a home. And you have walked past me every day like I'm another piece of furniture you inherited. That's not. He took a step forward. Eliza, that's not how I see you. Then how do you see me? The question landed hard. Thomas stood still for a long moment. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods. The lamp flickered. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I see a woman who deserves better than a half-broken rancher who doesn't know how to do this anymore. Who came here brave enough to try again when most people would have quit. Who works like she's trying to outrun something that won't let her rest. Eliza's throat tightened. I watch you every day, Thomas continued. I see you hang laundry in the wind. I smell bread baking when I'm out checking fence lines. I come home to a house that feels alive again. He paused. But I didn't know how to tell you that without sounding like I only valued your labor. So I stayed silent. And I made everything worse. For 3 weeks, Eliza had built walls inside herself. Walls made of work, of usefulness, of not needing anything from him. Now those walls were crumbling. I don't know how to just be, she admitted quietly. My first husband married me for my father's land. When my father died and the land was lost, my husband made certain I understood my worthlessness. After he passed, I had nothing. No home. No value. Coming here, I thought, her voice caught. I thought if I could just be indispensable enough, maybe I'd earn the right to stay. Thomas crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. He stopped just in front of her, close enough that she could see the pain in his dark eyes. You don't have to earn anything, he said. You're my wife. This is your home. Not because you scrub floors or bake bread, but because you chose to come here. That's enough. Is it? She looked up at him. Because I don't know what we are, Thomas. We're not strangers. We're not friends. We're barely partners. We're just 2 people haunted by different ghosts, living under the same roof. He was quiet for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 43 years. After Margaret died, he said, I stopped living. I worked until I couldn't think. I built fences. I moved cattle. I did everything except feel. When I finally decided to try again, to find a wife, I told myself it would be practical, sensible. No feelings to lose this time. He looked at her. But then you stepped off that train, and you looked determined, strong, like you'd survived a war. And I thought, here's someone who understands. Someone who won't ask me to be something I'm not. What are you? Eliza asked softly. Thomas met her eyes. Scared, he said. Scared that if I let myself care again, I'll lose it. Scared that I'm too broken to be a real husband. Scared that you'll wake up one day and realize you deserve more than this half-life I'm offering. The honesty broke something loose in her chest. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I'm scared too, she said. Scared that I'll never be more than useful. Scared that rest feels like failure. Scared that if I stop moving, I'll disappear. They sat in the warm kitchen, lamplight pulling between them, 2 people finally speaking truth. I don't want to disappear, Thomas said quietly. And I don't want you to either. Eliza looked at his weathered hands resting on the table. Hands that had guided hers earlier. Hands that had swept up broken porcelain. Slowly, carefully, she reached across and placed her bandaged palm over his. He didn't pull away. Then maybe, she said, we start again. No more silence. No more assumptions. Just honesty. Thomas turned his hand over, gently holding hers. I'd like that. They sat together as the lamp burned low, and for the first time since their wedding, the silence between them felt like peace instead of distance. The church social came 2 days later. Eliza had been uncertain about attending, but Thomas simply said, "We'll go together," and that settled it. The small gathering at Crestwood's community hall was warm with conversation and the smell of shared food. Women Eliza had never properly met welcomed her kindly. Thomas stayed close, introducing her with quiet pride. "My wife, Eliza. Not the new Mrs. Brennan. Not my housekeeper. My wife." Something about the way he said it made her stand a little straighter. On the ride home, wrapped in blankets against November cold, Thomas spoke into the darkness. "You made 4 pies." "I did." "That's too many pies, Eliza." She was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but real. "You're right," she admitted. "It is too many pies." "Why'd you make them?" She considered this. "Because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Because stillness feels dangerous. Because," she stopped. "Because it's easier to bake than to sit with your own thoughts." Thomas finished gently. "Yes." He was quiet for a while, guiding the horses through darkness. "I do the same thing. Work until I'm too tired to think. Maybe we could try something different." "Like what?" "Like sitting together after supper. Reading. Talking. Just being." The word being hung in the cold air like a promise. That night, after dishes were done, Eliza did not immediately retreat to her room. Instead, she sat in the chair by the fire. Thomas settled across from her with a book, then paused. "Would you like me to read aloud?" he asked. She nodded. His voice filled the room, deep and steady, reading from a collection of frontier stories. Eliza closed her eyes and simply listened. For the first time in weeks, she felt her shoulders relax. When he finished a chapter, Thomas looked up. "Eliza?" She had fallen asleep in the chair, head tilted against the worn upholstery, bandaged hand resting in her lap. She looked peaceful, young, almost, despite everything she'd survived. Thomas set the book aside quietly. He stood and carefully lifted a quilt from the sofa, draping it over her. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake. He returned to his chair and simply sat, watching the fire, listening to her breathe. "This," he thought. "This is what I wanted and didn't know how to ask for." Winter deepened. Snow blanketed the ranch in white silence. But inside the house, something was thawing. They developed rhythms. Thomas began coming in for midday meals instead of staying out until dark. Eliza started asking him about the cattle, about repairs needed, about decisions. He answered fully, treating her questions with respect. She baked less frantically. He talked more freely. One afternoon, Thomas found her standing at the window, simply watching snow fall. Not working, not moving, just standing. "You all right?" he asked. She turned to him with a small smile. "I'm resting." The word held weight. "Victory." "Good," he said. He came to stand beside her, and they watched the snow together in comfortable silence. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Eliza spoke carefully. "Thomas, I'd been sleeping in the guest room." He looked up, uncertain where this was leading. "I'd like—" She paused, gathering courage. "If you're willing, I'd like to move into the main bedroom. With you." His expression shifted. Hope, cautious but real. "I'm willing. But only if you're certain. I don't want you to feel obligated." "I don't feel obligated," she said quietly. "I feel like I'd like to try being your wife. Really being your wife. Not just a name." Thomas stood and crossed to her chair. He knelt beside it, taking her hands gently. "I'd like that too. More than I can say." She leaned forward and kissed him. It was tentative, exploratory, the first kiss they'd shared since their wedding day. But it was real. That night, Eliza moved her belongings into the room that had once belonged to Thomas alone. He helped her, carrying her trunk, making space in the wardrobe. They moved around each other carefully, learning. This new closeness. When they finally lay down together, Thomas pulled her close. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what?" "For staying. For fighting. For asking me that question." She smiled against his chest. "Which question?" "When you asked what I was. What we were." It made me finally answer it. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The ranch awakened. Grass pushed through melting snow. Calves were born. The house aired out. Windows opened to fresh wind. Eliza stood on the porch one April morning, coffee in hand, watching Thomas work with the horses. He looked up, caught her watching, and smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes. She smiled back. Later that week, a letter arrived from her sister back east. Eliza read it by the window, then carried it to Thomas in the bar. "My sister writes that she's worried about me," Eliza said. "She thinks frontier life must be unbearably hard." Thomas leaned against the stall door. "What will you tell her?" Eliza considered the question. She thought about broken teacups and too many pies, about silence and exhaustion and walls built from fear. But she also thought about honesty spoken in lamplight, about hands held across tables, about learning to rest, about being seen. "I'll tell her," Eliza said, "that it's hard. But it's also good, because I finally found someone who doesn't need me to be perfect, just present." Thomas crossed the barn and took her hand. "You did find that. And so did I." They stood together in the doorway, looking out at land they would work together, at a life they were building not from desperation but from choice. That evening, after supper, Eliza sat by the fire. Not working, not proving, just sitting. Thomas settled beside her, book in hand. "Shall I read, please?" His voice filled the room again, and Eliza closed her eyes, finally at peace. She had learned that marriage wasn't about being useful. It was about being real. And in this house, with this quiet man who had finally learned to speak, she was both. The tired bride had found her answer, and it was enough.